welcome. And I wanted to let you know that the rain is intentional. The common theme of our two talks today is fluidity. The water is good today, so we want lots of water in the vicinity. This is part of a year-long series on new media, feminist approaches in research, teaching, and activism. And I also wanted to say a few words about the concept. We're really looking here at the implications and modes of digital technologies and their effect on transnational exchange and the mediation of knowledge through a feminist lens. Our two speakers today, Suzon Fuks and San Filippo, are going to first present each about 20 minutes or so, their projects, then they're going to respond to their projects, and then we'll open it up for discussion. And those of you who have time later on will have a smaller faculty seminar about some other works that they have recommended. Suzon Fuks is an internationally recognized intermedia artist, choreographer, and director. As many of you know, she's also a very generous person, and she never sleeps. She has offered, also as a Copeland Fellow at Amherst College, a series of workshops, and there's still availability in her workshops on using a platform called TAP that I'm sure you'll learn a little bit about in a moment. She focuses also on screen dance and networked performance, and during her Australia Council for the Arts Fellowship, she initiated and co-founded Waterwheel, which we're going to hear about today. I also wanted to note that she has an astounding record of cooperation globally, and that she has won a number of prizes for her work, her productions, her installations, both her solo work and her work with others around the world. And that she is also the co-artistic director of the intermediate performance company Igneous, and she's been the director since 1997. San Filippo is a accomplished scholar. She's also teaching this semester at Harvard and MIT, so she's also very busy. And she actually gave a talk last Saturday night at Mass MoCA in North Adams as part of their series called Nerd Night, which is a wonderful series, a little bit like TED Talks in some ways, to sort of invite people who have interesting things to say to come and talk about them. And she talked about Mumblecore and indie films, and she's going to tell us what that is in case you don't know. She's a graduate of UCLA. She has a doctorate in cinema and media studies. And she also, we're anticipating her first book, The B Word, Bisexuality in Contemporary Film and Television, which is forthcoming this spring. So we'll celebrate that. And she has published numerous articles and reviews in all the major film journals, in Media Res, Film History, Cine Action. She has articles in volumes. Most recently in a volume called Millennial Masculinity, Men in Contemporary American Cinema. And she's working on a new project, After the Death of Cinema, Old New Media Conversions and Alternative Theories, Spaces, and Communities. And she's looking at the convergence of old and new media and how communities of women filmmakers, film historians, and cinephiles use digital media to make, preserve, distribute, and appreciate cinematic works by, for, and about women.
I'm originally from Belgium, from Brussels, where we have a lot of water. It rains a lot, and apparently there is a lot of water. And I have been already interested by water as a beautiful aesthetic thing. And then I traveled, and I went to, one of my travel was in India, and I lived there for 3 years. And there really my understanding about water changed and shifted completely, because although I had access to a tap, the hours of running tap was very limited during the day, and we had to boil the water, we had to keep the water in some vessels, so it was part of the daily routine to take at least an hour, if not more, every day about water, although we had access to the tap. And we also had a ground well, so that was pretty luxurious. So after that, I moved to Australia, and I am based now in Brisbane, which is a subtropical city. And there in 2005, we had a big drought, which actually happened in very, very little time. And I must say that I looked at your rivers here. I know that it is supposed to be the valley of plenty, but you had a really hard summer, and your rivers are really, really, really low. So although maybe you don't think it can happen, it actually can at any time very quickly to be actually without water or very little water. And to complete the image of that is that we lived several years with a pretty high restriction on water in Brisbane. Suddenly it rained a lot, and we've been flooded last year, really bad flood. So that can also happen without, although we could see that the water was rising, there are so many other factors that can enter, and for Brisbane it was the dam factor that was not counted because after the previous flood they built a dam, and the dam went so quickly high, it was nearly 200% content, and they had to release the water, and that was the unfortunate unknown factor which made really the flood even worse than what was supposed to happen. Anyway, so these are all these things that little by little made me think about water more and more. Okay, I did record and took sample in video and sound of all the waters around the world where I went. And then I made some shows about water. But then I started to really be more interested by social issue, political issue around that. And I got a fellowship from the Australia Council, as Karen said, to deepen my research on network performance. So network performance is also called internet performance, or performance on internet, or web performance, or cyberformance, or cyber performance, or telematic performance. For the moment, there is a lot of different denomination about more or less the same thing. That means that you have a performer in one place using some telecommunication tools to deliver a content across internet, basically. So you can have people across the globe in different locations. You can also have the audience with the performer and the other performers disseminated, or you can also have the audience disseminated across the globe. So that's in general, what is the internet performance. So I researched that a lot. I researched the different technologies, and at the same time I was really interested by social media and observed a lot and how it functions, and I found that having a theme, and the theme of water being global and also something which is so culturally embedded in every continent, in every country, region, so it would be a way for people to connect. So with that fellowship, I continued the research, and I got some more funding to work with a team of designers and also programmers and artists from around the world to test the platform, and we created Waterwheel. So I'm going to ask you to now move and around the table, yeah, and I'm going to be at the computer. Here's Waterwheel. When people arrive on the home page, they see the wheel, which is actually made by the latest upload. People can upload different media. They can, for instance, the orange is sound media. They can upload also video. Here, there's a video. They can upload animation, stills, documents. So it's a YouTube for water, but bigger than YouTube in a way, because you can put all kind of media. Also spreadsheets for data. So you'll find how it works step by step. Oops, Photoshop is coming up, sorry. So you'll find how it works here. There is a little manual step by step, and also some here in English and Spanish. And you have some video tutorial. Here you have actually the list of what is going to happen on the tap. So the tap is actually a video conferencing media mixing system, which is what has been the biggest research we've done, and I'm going to show it to you. The fountains is a global map, which is also coupled with a timeline, which allows to see, for instance, what happened in the past or what will happen in the future. So you can go here, that's a super D tap. Here I think it's a rehearsal for the birthday. On the 22nd of August, it was the first year of the launch of the platform. So we are very young. And for instance, here, the 22nd of March, you see different things which happen for the World Water Day. The orange one are more things which happen not online. It can be exhibition or launch of a book, which is not online. Here, yeah. So I'm going to go straight to the tap. I think it's here. And voila. So this is the video conferencing system where people can perform, but can also James is also on the tap. James is my partner and worked also in the team. So on the tap, what is special, it's like a Skype. If you want for a group, you can have up to 6 webcams. But what is special is that you can move everything. You can move, you can, oh, you are stuck a bit, James, on me. Maybe you can put your webcam. So, yeah, he's on wireless. So you can position your media. You can enlarge them. Here's Karen. So this is a true internet. And you can do that with your 6 webcam as well as your media. So I'm going to bring, for instance, a little tap. That's an animation. So I can do the same thing here. What you see is actually a crew view. The audience do not see the little palette here. They see only the stage, the white page here, and they also see just this chat. The upper chat is actually the wings. It's like in theater. It's an internal chat where you can prepare yourself, prepare the speakers. And for instance, you can have, or I'm going to take an English one, I think that's in French. This is like a PowerPoint if you want, but on the tab it's a bit different because you can move it, you can hide it. So you can have some media that you can show here, and you can also draw. So maybe James, you can draw here. Draw the attention to the URL of the Waterwheel. You can have also some video that you can put in a loop. So with all these possibilities, it's possible. You can make new ways of performance and new ways of presenting. All right, so thank you. Yeah, everything can move, even your drawing. Great.
Can you layer them?
Yes, you can layer, and you have 6 layers, like in Photoshop. The bottom, yes, yeah, we can do that. Like I can make James here. And the water mosaic here. Yeah, and when you put the mouse out, you see what the audience sees. You don't see anymore the palette of tools. Okay, so I'm going to show you a few events which have happened on the tab, just to give an idea. The first one is a performance that I directed with 5 performers from different countries, and we took facts about water that each told in their own language.
الماء مذيب لفيتامينات والأملاح والأحماض والأملاح. يلعب الماء دورا حيويا في هضم وامتصاص ونقل واستخدام العناصر الحيوية. الماء أحسن حاجة موجودة في الكون.
Launch of Earthwater Catalogue by Yule. Kate Harrison presents her water diary on the Daily Tap with Suzon.
נובמבר 2011 סימפוזיום בינלאומי של מדעי המים ומשאבי המים.
So the next one is an installation performance where the audience were on site and they were going through a whole journey. One of the things was also sharing water. And then at the end they were actually pledging to do something for water in a very, very basic way, something that they could do.
Nice, Rebecca. To the right side of the computer, and we're going to share the water between the two of us.
And here we go.
Okay.
Here goes some water.
Oh, there we go. My highlight today was just the flow of the show. My wish would be that we could all share the water, so everyone would always have plenty of clean drinking water.
So this is for the World Water Day on 22nd of March. We're going to have every year a symposium across the globe. So this year was the first, and I invited Riccardo Petrella, who is the author of the Water Manifesto, to come and talk about what just happened in Marseille with the World Water Forum. All the government and corporate were there discussing of how they're going to share the pie. And Ricardo is also very instrumental in having helped to pass the access to water as a human rights in the UN Charter 2 years ago. Welcome, Ricardo.
Good morning, Susan, and good morning to everybody. Hello to the friends from Tunisia and the Sousse University. I am, en tout cas, bonjour à vous toutes, tous. I am very honored to participate in this inaugural session. And Susan asked me to make a few comments on water problems and issues we are facing with today.
You can see all his address in the media center of the Waterwheel. It's all there. I also invited Ule, who was the partner of Marina Abramovic, to also inaugurate the symposium. It was really fascinating because he also has a big work about water, which is called Earth Water Catalogue. Then one of the events that I also organize is a daily tap where I have some guests, and I've invited Kate Harrington, who started in 2008 a big research on water and gender issues.
So then the one for the next one. Yep, and then go back to the first one. And then back to the second one. So what I'm showing you here is this one here is the male's water chore performance rate in the household surveyed in 2008, and the previous one was the female water chore performance in 2008. And it's quite clear that women use a lot more water, performing a lot more water chores than men do.
So here you can find in the media center, you can type, for instance, Ricardo, and you'll find his, yeah. So here you see several things, also the paper about the Water Manifesto. I have 2 more minutes of video of women who are interviewed on the Waterwheel. I took some excerpts to, but I don't know, before I pass on to Maria, I thought that if you have questions, I'd rather respond to question than showing the women's interview. Because I prefer to respond now, because after we're going to go to a completely different subject. So I don't know.
So what are your plans for the future in terms of where you imagine this project going, how it will continue?
It's an ongoing project. We are actually now trying to commercialize the software of the tap in order to sustain Waterwheel, because we would like to not be funded by corporate. So yeah, so for the moment that's actually what I'm working on, is to connect with people to help me to commercialize it. Yeah. Yeah.
This is a very old-fashioned question, but I'm curious about the relationship between this project and water distribution.
Yes.
I mean, I certainly see, I do a lot of cultural politics, so I see the virtues right away, but I don't know if you could say a bit about the relationship between the project and water distribution or redistribution.
Yes, sure. So first of all, the Waterwheel is made for raising awareness. Yeah. That's one thing. Second is in exchanging knowledge. So people could use it for organizational purposes, and definitely interested by that, to help people to use it for that reason. Well, for the moment, what interests me the most is really the interaction between artist, activist, and academic, in order to find new ways of first raising awareness, and then also finding new ways of distributing. Yeah, definitely. So, yeah.
I wonder if you're, whether Waterwheel is exploring ways of mitigating the water usage in agriculture, which is such a very heavy user of clean water. I know that, for example, I just finished a film, and a lot of farmers are moving towards a hydroponic idea because it uses so much less water.
Yeah, and
is Waterwheel involved in agriculture as well?
Well, actually, Waterwheel is a platform for all the people who work with water to actually connect and everyone can make their own tap. So people can talk about that too. We, as a platform, organize few events, but people can organize their own events. So definitely interested by that too. And also we have some social, we have a Facebook group and we have a blog where people can also write. Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to suggest that we move
on
because we're already past time.
Yeah.
Okay, because I want Maria to have
yeah.
As well.
Sure.
We'll, we can come back to this. I think there is a connection between both your talks, and I think we'll see it clearer when we hear Maria. But thank you very much, Suzon.
Yeah.
Hi everyone, thank you for coming. So the project I'm talking about today is both new and old in a couple of different ways. It's new and old for me personally because it derives from a couple of previous projects that I've completed and I'm moving on from. One is my book project on bisexuality that Karen mentioned, and I'll say more about that in a bit. The other is a project on Mumblecore, which I'll tell you about first off. But it's also new for me, this particular avenue that I'm taking it now. So that is to say that this is going to be a sort of preliminary and informal discussion of the work ahead, not behind me. So I welcome your feedback and your ideas. It's also new and old because, as again Karen referenced, my next book project has to do with the meeting of old and new media. And in my field, media studies, we typically mean by that digital and film being the new and the old media at hand. So I'm moving away from looking at film as a kind of material substance, and that's the death of cinema that I refer to in the new book title, however tentatively. We're very clearly moving away from film, photographic film, and towards digital video. But I think what I'm interested in and curious about is the way in which digital video is actually making it available and accessible and newly enhanced the potential for a so-called filmic form, by which I mean the representation of reality as a kind of documentary style mode of very naturalistically and authentically representing reality. So this would be a potential that digital video has that I see as being quite counter to its other great potential, which I think is for a very kind of computer-generated, spectacular, fantasy-based aesthetic. So I'm looking at the kind of other end of the spectrum of a very, what I'm calling, and what others have called, neo-realist perspective. Okay, so just a bit about Mumblecore because it's from this 21st century film movement, and the first film movement of the 21st century, that my topic for today and the filmmakers I'm addressing herein derive. So Mumblecore is a film movement from the aughts, which has to do with a group of artists loosely collaborating in order to make very low budget films that are self-financed. This is incredibly do-it-yourself. They are largely improvised in terms of their dialogue. They're very dialogue-driven films. They have to do typically with the kind of micro-dramas of everyday life and the emotional inarticulation of the characters within, hence the Mumblecore name that it's been given, much to the chagrin of the people who have to take on that identification as Mumblecore filmmakers, but it has served its purpose as a kind of critical and brand-ready moniker. So these films are, I think, interesting in that, again, they both look back and forward. They are neo-realist, as A.O. Scott from the New York Times named a kind of more global phenomenon towards more documentary-style filmmaking, greater authenticity, greater realism that comes with digital accessibility and affordability for filmmakers. And one other way of looking at the Mumblecore aesthetic and ethic, which I think it is as well, is to think about it as a slow cinema in the sense of the slow food movement. It shares with that emphasis on localism, on sustainability, and on a very intensive appreciation experience. So I think those are a couple of useful ways in which Mumblecore has been described. So it both looks back to that kind of fly-on-the-wall aesthetic of documentary filmmaking and neorealism, in which everyday stories were given very conscientious, meticulous treatment. But it also looks forward to, I think, our contemporary moment in which we sort of live life as a movie in all the various respects of online media, YouTube, social networking, reality television, all of these ways in which we are accustomed to living a mediated lifestyle, right? Mumblecore filmmakers have defended their own films, though, as being like the home movie that you actually want to watch. So that's all I'm going to say about Mumblecore, but if you are curious to read more, my article in Cine Action is online at that website. And I'll say just a bit about the way in which new media has enabled Mumblecore and also 21st century independent filmmaking more generally. First of all, through the technological and industrial evolutions that have included the development of low-price digital video cameras. For $3,000, you could purchase this Panasonic camera and make a film. That was not possible before, at least not with cameras that would produce the same sort of film-like image that these did. Along with laptop publishing software, such as Final Cut Pro. And then new venues and channels for distribution have come about. Certainly film festivals as an alternative theatrical venue for film. South by Southwest has been incredibly important in the films that I'm discussing and thinking about, along with Sundance and others. The Independent Film Channel, the IFC, and the Independent Film Center is one example of a more kind of boutique or specialty division production company, which takes as its mission to promote and distribute and exhibit films that are more low budget and more artistic in these various alternative venues. So rather than playing in a more a traditional theater venue, they're distributed via various digital means, streaming, video on demand, and via these other alternative distribution methods, we have come to expect a new kind of model for distribution, which is kind of exemplified by this what's called day and date or multi-platform release of the first film, Bubble, but many since then. For example, a film that opened today that I'll be talking about, Nobody Walks, opened in theaters today in New York and LA only, but it's also available on iTunes today. So various channels of distribution allow for films in this very kind of post-art cinema mediascape to still get the kind of distribution that allows them to be seen. So it's really a kind of saving grace for independent cinema. The paradox of all of this is that it's actually been enabled by the vertical reintegration and the conglomeratization of the film industry, by which I mean for IFC, as an example, they are able to produce and promote and distribute the films that they choose to do because they're owned by a far bigger sort of behemoth, Cablevision, in fact, which is able to risk via its diversification of assets the type of less profitable, higher risk, creatively films such as the ones that IFC promotes. So these are the kinds of films that I'm looking at. And one film that's been very important to me, to this project, is Humpday, which you see on the left here, a woman-directed film, which I'm actually not going to say anything more about until I've had a chance to show you a clip from it. So this should give you a sense of both the aesthetic style of Mumblecore, but also the sort of narrative preoccupations that it undertakes. There are no minors in the audience. I always have to warn people this is kind of sexually graphic.
Whoa. Good morning. Pleasant surprise. Hello.
I really don't want to talk to you right now.
You want to have sex with me? You don't want to talk to me?
Look, I spent a lot of time last night being mad at you, and I just don't want to talk to you right now.
I'm not comfortable with... What the fuck is this? I'm not really... What are we doing here?
Get it?
Whoa. I'm sorry. I just think that's a little weird.
What happened last night? I spent so much time really trying not to be mad at you, trying to just understand, but you know, you didn't give me much to work with. So can you please explain to me what happened?
Can we just go back a second real quick? You just came in here and mounted me like a horse. And you wouldn't even let me kiss you.
You remember that I'm ovulating right now? And that we had this tiny little window that actually pretty much ended last night, and I was just kind of hoping that we might be able to finish it today, but...
Alright, I'm sorry, alright? I'm sorry. You're right. I've screwed up,
I just
okay?
want to know what happened. I need you to make me understand.
Andrew was there, and he's just like a wild card, and I was trying to just look after him, and then he was pouring shit, and I got a little drunk, and I just needed to sober up before I came home.
And it took you until 3 a.m. to sober up to come home? I'm not buying it, Ben. I mean, you know, Andrew's a big boy. He's been out fucking herding goats or whatever he does. And you have to look after him? I don't get it.
All right. It was kind of fun.
Oh.
I mean, look, I'm not going to hang out with him every weekend. These people aren't going to be my best friends, but it was fun for a night to experience some different people and some different conversation, and I enjoyed it, okay? I just feel like on the eve of us making a family and having kids, we shouldn't be subscribing so much to that lifestyle that we like close ourselves off completely from other experiences. If anything, I think we should do more of those kinds of things, you know what I'm saying? As parents.
Where's the we in this? You left me with some fucking pork chops
Well, I invited
last
you.
night.
I mean, I invited you.
You invited me in the most half-assed, like,
Well, that was before.
I don't know if you like it here. It's really boring and weird and uncomfortable, but you should totally come down. What do you think I'm gonna do?
I know, but that was before it got kind of fun, so I'm sorry, all right? I don't know, man. I mean, I gotta say, just for a second, I know it was my fault and I screwed up, but I'm a pretty great husband, and I'm always on time, and I'm always stuff. And I screwed up like one night. I feel like I deserve just like, can I just get like a get out of jail free card? Like can I just get a pass on this one?
I just don't even know what to do with that.
And it was not fair.
Get out of jail free. I mean, that's fine. I'm gonna go take a shower.
Well, we can talk about this. I mean,
It's fine. You're right. It's cool. I shouldn't be mad.
I'm sorry. That was my fault. I'm grumpy and I'm tired, and can you come back to bed, please?
Okay, so you see there a typical type of scene from Mumblecore. And some of the things that I would just highlight about that scene are, of course, the use of nudity and sexual frankness, but not for purposes of titillation so much as for an exploration of intimacy. A very kind of frank discussion and depiction of adult sexuality. And I think a kind of art cinema style ambiguity and flawedness and human-likeness of the characters involved in their relationships. So this is the kind of departure point for my next project, because Humpday, because of its premise, and the sort of bromance style, and if you don't know what the bromance is, I'll just quickly say that it's a contemporary sort of subgenre of romantic comedy produced by Hollywood, in which men and their homosexual relationships are at the center of the narrative. So I think Lynn Shelton, in making Humpday and in even marketing it as a kind of quasi-bromance, was very much confronting and critiquing the bromance tradition, and actually I think kind of pushing it to its limits, because the premise of this film is that two lifelong friends decide, kind of dare one another to make a porn movie together for purposes of artistic exploration. So I'm not going to give away the ending if you haven't seen it. I won't let you know if they actually end up going through with it or not. But Shelton is interested in thinking about the questions of homosexuality, how it relates to homoeroticism, fluid sexualities, in the depiction of the marriage between the two partners that you just saw, how intimacy looks after the happy ever after that typically concludes romantic films and romantic narratives. And so in all of these ways, I think this film and other films by women directors within this Mumblecore aesthetic and ethic pertain to my other area of interest, which I've just completed my first book about, and that's a black and white image because I don't have a color one yet of the book cover. But in this book, I'm looking specifically at bisexuality, at the B word. But now, moving on, I'm interested in thinking about other types of alternative sexualities and sexual fluidities. So I find that in these films by women directors working within this Mumblecore idiom, we get a number of examples of a Mumblecore-style collaborative, alternative economic practice of filmmaking, and one that is also interested in thinking about alternative sexualities and sexual fluidity. So this is a few of the women that I am looking at, and these are the ones who came quite explicitly out of the Mumblecore movement. In some cases were actually partnered with or starring in or co-directing and writing Mumblecore features, and so have very explicitly come out of this tradition. These are just 4 main figures that you may have heard of already. A few others who did not come as specifically out of the Mumblecore tradition. The 2 on top, Sarah Polley and Zoe ListerJones, came out of acting. And the 2 on bottom are examples of international or transnational directors who have become kind of Mumblecore adjacent figures, who have broadened the scope beyond the pretty self-contained urban ghettos of Austin and Boston and Brooklyn, where most of these Mumblecore features have been taken place. So we see in So-Young Kim's work and in Maren Ade's work a kind of more global interest and interest in characters who have a more diasporic identity. So what's of interest to me, namely, is that all of these women are using these new media outlets and channels for making and distributing their work. Sometimes this takes the form of an actual collective for distributing work, such as the very recently created African American Film Festival Releasing Movement, which has recently released Middle of Nowhere. I haven't actually seen this film yet, it's just come out, but it has some interesting relation to my questions of non-monogamy, and furthermore regards people of color, which I am happy to be able to include, because this has been by and large a straight white movement, but not, as it's often assumed to be, as much of a boys' club as almost every other film movement has been. So I'll say more about that in just a moment, but these are the various means of access for finding these films. You will very rarely see these films distributed in a traditional cinematic venue, apart from, if you're lucky, New York and LA. So instead, these films are released through Netflix streaming, through iTunes, through video on demand, through Hulu, other sorts of digital distribution modes such as that. And a couple of things that I find really interesting that they all have in common is a focus on autobiography. These are often films that are concerned with self-narration, with how women's stories are told, with how artistic works are created, with how sexuality and gender are represented. And even furthermore, some of them I think are incredibly self-reflexive in that they're actually regarding the filmmaking process itself as a representation of their stories and of sexuality and gender. So these are two stills from Humpday and Nobody Walks, both of which actually explicitly address within their narrative the making of pornography, the making of avant-garde cinema, the making of bromances, and the making of other commercial Hollywood films as a kind of point of critique within the narrative themselves. Another thing that interests me about these films is that it is by no means the case that people are straight until proven otherwise, as is typically the case in our heteronormative culture. So you have all sorts of more ambiguous or fluid sexual identities being depicted and discussed and embodied by individual characters. Just as one example, in Humpday again, there is a scene in which the wife Anna, whom you saw earlier, mounting her husband, confesses to having had an affair, but it's quite noticeably never clarified what the gender of the person with whom she had the affair was. So that kind of gender-inspecific logic of desire is something quite interesting to me, as is these films' interest in exploring alternative relationships, having to do with non-monogamy, unconstrained monogamy, and polyamory. So sometimes quite explicitly, such as in The Freebie, a film in which a married couple explores non-monogamy, but sometimes in a way that's somewhat more subtle, but still approaches the question of non-traditional families and relationships in, I think, really interesting ways. The kind of testing point of how radical these films and I can take this question of alternative sexualities has to do with the notion of BDSM, which, if you don't know, is a kind of umbrella term that's often alternatively labeled kink, which I don't like as much, but it refers to bondage and discipline, dominance and submission, and sadism and masochism, and the various practices therein. And so what I'm interested in doing with this is thinking about how some of these films depict relationships founded on or involving things like abjection, submission, and masochism, and whether they are sort of recuperable or affirmative in expressing some sort of, or articulating some sort of BDSM identity. So that's where I am now. I've done the kind of textual analysis of these individual films that I'm interested in looking at and in comparing. I have a few methodological questions that are causing me a little more concern, and I wanted to end on that by raising them and asking if you might have any advice or feedback for me. One is how and whether to defend or define women as authors, because I am looking at exclusively women filmmakers. Second, how to integrate my examinations of nonconformity across these various form, content, and discourse modes. So the alternative economies that produce these films, the alternative sexualities that are represented within these films, and the reception to these films as enabling a discourse of sexual nonconformity. And then finally, how to theorize all of this most effectively. So I'll end there and open for questions, comments, anything you'd like. So the question for our videotaping purposes, just to reiterate what you've asked here, is that there seems to be a kind of like generational exclusivity to...
Or particularity.
Or particularity to both, I think you're saying, the people making these films, but also the people represented within them.
Yeah.
And I think that's absolutely true. I mean, I'm very grateful to Sarah Polley, actually, because in both of her films to date, she's taken on the question of age pretty explicitly within the narratives. So with Away From Her specifically, I think the question of non-monogamy among an aged couple, an elderly couple, right, is something that I'm going to be able to take on. No, I think it's Mumblecore adjacent, but I'm less concerned with defining Mumblecore as something very particular itself, as I am with talking about women who are making low-budget films, somewhat outside of the mainstream, who are taking on these questions of alternative sexualities. So yeah, she's apart from traditional Mumblecore, certainly, but she's kind of come of age in her directing alongside these other women directors that I'm looking at. So yeah, I mean, I think part of this is a gendered issue that women directors, and especially directing, has long been marginalized from mainstream Hollywood filmmaking, and thus you'll hear and see women directors often talk about going into other routes, whether it be television production as opposed to film production, where there's actually more amenability to women, or into other modes such as documentary, right? And so I think this is actually the first generation that has been able to create a sustained career as a, independent and mainstream are fluid categories, and I don't want to impart a kind of binary to them, but there is now a space available for filmmaking that is both commercial and artistic and alternative that women have access to that they did not before, and that's largely because of this so-called digital revolution. So I think it is generational in that it's just not been as available and accessible until now.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Maria, for your presentation. I've seen a lot of those films, actually. I was just also wondering, in terms of the questions you have integrated, my sort of understanding of that question in terms of integrating examinations of nonconformity. Mm-hmm. I was also thinking about conformity itself, because I actually saw a lot of those films, particularly the very lack of people of color, mm-hmm. even though they are self-reflexive in my own kind of life, says something about these women's lives themselves in terms of the circles in which they operate and the communities in which they're part of, and class as well. Mm-hmm. Even though I think in terms of class-wise, I think some people would be able to connect, but in terms of race and ethnicity, it's so lacking mm-hmm. in a lot of these films. And so I was just wondering, like, how do you think about sort of making sense of that, particularly because I see that as more conformity than non-conformity mm-hmm. with regards to the discourse and the content and production. I mean, maybe not so much the production, but even though in terms of who has access to those spaces versus mm-hmm. in terms of as women filmmakers, because it seems like the only sort of issue of race and ethnicity seems to be transnational, but there is a lot of within the U.S. context as well mm-hmm. that then doesn't get sort of represented here. So I was just wondering if you, right. Just sort of thinking about that as well as the possibility of how these films also are sort of conforming to mm-hmm. notions of race and ethnicity that they're not challenged or questioned as much, or mm-hmm. even they're not just part of their everyday lives, which says something itself too.
Absolutely, yeah. I mean, that's such an important question. So pertaining to how race and class work both in the representations that I'm addressing, but also in, I think, the production and reception or consumption of what I'm looking at. So, I'm sure you're probably familiar, some of you, with Lena Dunham's HBO series Girls and all of the flack it took for having virtually no people of color, at least no significant characters of color in the opening season. And her defense of it was in part that she was trying to give as an authentic and autobiographical treatment of her experience as possible, and that didn't include people of color, which is quite interesting, and it's certainly something that I think a lot of the other Mumblecore directors would probably say in their defense as well, because it is a very homogenous racially and economically group. That's part of the reason why I'm interested in widening my sphere of texts to incorporate others. I think it's true that the digital revolution has allowed for greater affordability and accessibility in terms of producing films, but in terms of actually seeing these films, I mean, might be half as expensive to watch it on iTunes as it is to watch it in the theater, but you have to have all of the platform available for watching iTunes. So it isn't necessarily as conducive to accessibility for the consumer as it is for the producer of these works, at least not for kind of class-based reasons. But in terms of the depiction of nonconformity, sexual nonconformity, I think it's actually the case that, without wanting to generalize too broadly, I think that from having just written a book on bisexuality, I know that sexual nonconformity in representation has been white for the most part. And it was a real struggle for me to find texts in which I could get more, examples of racial diversity having to do with bisexuality. So I think that's a representational limitation that kind of transcends my particular pool of films, but which is something that I'm trying to address as I go along. So I'm happy to take any suggestions. Yes.
One of the things that makes me crazy when it's time to ask questions is people who don't really ask questions. So here I am sort of not really asking a question, so if it makes you crazy, I'm sorry. It's already making me crazy. But maybe I can tag it onto your how to theorize most effectively. And I can't help getting out of my head the idea that there's a relationship between what these women directors are exploring right now and what people like John Cassavetes were exploring in the 1950s and 1960s. And that just as the digital revolution here is freeing up so much and making it possible to explore what's happening inside of me, just the big me. With the digital camera, it was Cassavetes with his 16mm camera which set him free. And basically he was exploring very similar kinds of questions, which is to say deep personal investigations as to what makes my life tick. And but it also happened at a time when the world was like in turmoil. And I see the world again in huge turmoil. And I wonder, I'm sorry that it's not a question, I wish it were. But is there a relationship in your mind as well to those things?
Absolutely, yes. I see Mumblecore and all of the films that I'm looking at in this sort of neo-realist vein as being, nothing necessarily new, but rather a continuation of the way in which independent filmmaking has evolved. And I think it does become more important at points in history when we're most sort of in conflict, whether it's industrially, in the sense of people being closed out by, a more kind of narrow sense of what kinds of films can get made and shown. And we certainly have that now. But I think in the 60s with Cassavetes, the 16mm camera set him free, but there were also all sorts of venues in which such films, such as the Cassavetes aesthetic, could be shown, and I think that's no longer the case today. So things have shifted.
Except in the digital domain.
I'm sorry? Except in the digital domain, exactly. So there are kind of historical specificities to the way in which independent filmmaking is accessible, right? Both to the producers and to the consumers. But yeah, I agree that film now seems to be, these particular films seem to be very much inspired by a response to the economic recession, certainly. They're very kind of anti-waste, anti-excess, anti-outsourcing, local again. And I think also that they display a certain kind of millennial or post 9/11 or however you want to describe it, sense of disillusion and dismay over various kinds of global crises.
And I'm moving inside, question inside and saying that the outside is too much. And what the outside is doing is causing all kinds of turmoil inside of me, so rather than look outside, I'll look inside of the turmoil of me and try to work that through.
Right, and maybe a more sort of optimistic way of putting that would be to say that these filmmakers are less interested in creating stories that are, you know, as A.O. Scott talked about, fantasies of magical thinking, which is what, you know, big budget Hollywood global cinema is more and more about. And also are un-American in the way that they don't presume to speak for everyone, but actually presume to speak only for themselves. So these filmmakers have been criticized for talking about their struggling love lives when there's a war on, right, for example. And in their defense, they and I would say, you know, that they're talking about what they know.
Well, we're also talking about the war that's in themselves, that's caused in part by the war that's external, and using, and I'm sorry, but there's also a lot of dogma influence. The dogma.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, dogma, for those who might not know, is a film movement of the 90s in which, even more rigorous than Mumblecore, in which filmmakers that derived in Denmark, filmmakers would take a vow of chastity, in which they would vow not to do anything manipulative, like use artificial lighting on the set of their films, or use pre-recorded music, or anything such as that, to attempt to capture as authentically as possible whatever it was.
But their stories were still, compared to these stories that you just showed us, those stories I would characterize as more external than internally focused.
And more dramatic, I would say, as well. Right? I mean, these are really anti-dramatic stories. You know, they're unresolved oftentimes. There's a famous case of one ending mid-sentence. I mean, they're very art cinematic in the way in which they leave things ambiguous and unresolved, but they're also just about the everyday. They're really not attempting to be dramatic, but rather just to show that kind of slice of life.
This is sort of off topic, but I'm just really interested what your background is and how you became interested in this aspect of film.
Well, my background is in media studies in terms of my scholarship, but I've always been interested in questions of alternative sexuality and sexual nonconformity. And I think also within my consideration of film and television, I've always tended towards an interest in realism and naturalism. So I think, you know, this is kind of the perfect storm of all of my interests, this particular sphere of filmmaking that I'm looking at now. But my interests derive from, you know, all sorts of historical and artistic traditions within film and television that I think are invested in resisting and pushing boundaries around gender and sexuality norms and against, I think, aesthetic norms as well. Yeah, that's my succinct description of how I got here.
Yeah, I wanted to also include Suzon in my question. So this is a question for both of you.
And I'm going to sit.
Okay, that's fine. And my question is about, you've mentioned, both of you are talking about artistic production, using technology for artistic production, and the issue of distribution and simultaneity. So for instance, in the installations that you talked about, Suzon, or much of what the Waterwheel and the tap enables is communication and participation, cooperation in real time. So in some ways, that's people stepping out of their lives for a moment to connect, you know, globally. And the kind of production that you're talking about in some ways is almost, there is an audience in mind. And it is participatory in the sense that some of the actors are not professional, or some of them are, some of them aren't. But it seems to me that the use of technology on the one hand is to create sort of collective communication and change, social action to some extent, but also through art. Whereas this genre seems to be, even though we can say, well, the inner war and all that, seems to be less about producing something outside of itself. It seems to be very much, very insular in a certain way. I'm just wondering what you two think.
Well, I don't know enough the Mumblecore and the indie above all in America, so I can't really. But I think what comes out for me is the criticism of the economical regime That's why we're actually going to continue the seminar. It's on gift economy, and see how we find new ways of producing and making and exchanging knowledge also by using the media. So yeah, for me it's the criticism that this can have with a very daily take, like a daily life take. I think that's pretty powerful because people can really project themselves into them. Although it's true that from what I've seen, but I don't know enough, not everybody is represented, as you said. So, but you still can kind of project your daily life, even if it's something shocking, or it can be reaching your fantasy. So, in a way, or something I would have done, or I don't know. In that way, and but then it goes into a much deeper level where I think, yeah, the media have overtaken really well. The media, that's a very dangerous discussion because we start to talk about new media, and I don't know still what people think about new media here, because for me I think it's not the same. But the media as television, as you said, traditionally television, film, radio, they kind of overtook a little bit and communalized the daily life. And so this is pretty, for me, a very strong comment. Although it doesn't have yet a full visibility, it's kind of, it's springing. The comment is springing. For me, that's important. And that's important also for internet. That you can start to comment on the bigger traditional media or structure, and structure which use media, old media. So, if it,
Just to follow up on something you said, Karen, I mean, I think certainly that the stories are insular and that they are self-examinations. But I think in terms of the production and the hopes for distribution of these films, they've always looked outward. There is, of course, this complicating factor of the indie culture, which we'll talk about in the seminar as well, being its own kind of exclusive interior or insular culture. But I think these filmmakers have, through collaboration and through finding and sustaining all of these really inventive routes for alternative distribution, managed to spread the word, to disseminate quite widely. With that comes ultimately, inevitably, the question of how they're going to become complicit in profit, commercial growth, and sponsorship. And I think, alongside Suzon's project, the social activist aims have to still remain entrenched within the capitalist system, and the question of how to retain authenticity and autonomy within that is something that's really central to both of our projects. You may have remained less complicit than the Mumblecore director, Suzon, thus far, but the question is always looming, whether to sell out.
Can I say two more things about the Waterwheel before, because I see the time and that we're going to go through the seminar very soon. I forgot to say that on the tap you can, people are independent to make their own projects, and they can make their own tap private or public. So that's very important. They can choose when they schedule. They have to schedule their sessions. They can have as many sessions as they want, but they have only 2-hour sessions at a time, but they can be successive. So that's important to know for organizational purposes. It's not always, it doesn't have to be always public. That's one thing. Then the other thing is, I forgot to say, that I'm going to give workshops to faculty and staff on the 3rd of November here, and also on the 1st of December for the students. And yeah, we have some, yeah, sorry, I forgot, because there is still, I mean, it's based on serve in first serve. I think for faculty and staff, there is still some, but for the students, it has to be really, yeah, so if you are interested, it would be great to pass on the information.
Okay, so I wanted to thank Suzon and Maria again for your presentation.